There's a cost of doing business with everything. In particular, for our class, what we're worried about is that a firm cannot just get the inputs for free, right? So a firm we're thinking of as a production technology which takes inputs and produces outputs according to some fixed function. This function has inputs, which are in general going to be considered capital and labor, and it's going to produce some output. And the point that we're making now is that when deciding what kind of inputs to acquire in order to create output, the primary factor will be the fact that these inputs are costly. I took this sentence from the textbook, I think. I took it from somewhere. It says the economic cost of an input is the payment required to keep that input in its present employment. I don't know what that means. That sounds like jargon or gibberish or something. Like I don't. You got to pay for your inputs, right? You got to buy your computers. You got to hire your laborers and pay them a wage. I guess that's what that means in some kind of fancy economics language. But the cost is the cost. The cost is that you got to spend some money or whatever the unit of currency is, but money or some opportunity cost, but generally thought of as money, in order to acquire capital and labor, which are then used as the inputs to create an output. Because we're working in this simplified model where there's two inputs, capital and labor, our cost vector is just going to be the cost of capital, CK, and the cost of labor, CL. And when the firm employs L worth of labor and K worth of capital, its total cost that it spends is the cost of labor times the amount of labor spent plus the cost of capital times the amount of capital purchased. And that's just, C dot LK, right? It's just the cost vector times the input vector. But one thing to notice is that we are assuming that prices here are constant. In the same way that in the consumption world, we assumed that prices were constant, that you don't get quantity discounts, you don't get, you don't save when you buy in bulk. You buy 5 tractors, get 1 free kind of thing. So the cost of capital is constant no matter how much capital is purchased. The same thing with labor. Now, obviously, these things are not true, right? Something called a monopsonist, you heard right, not a monopolist, a monopsonist, is one who hires, is the only game in town for hiring, right? It's the only job, the only source of supply for jobs. And if you're the only source of supply for jobs, then you can pay essentially according to people's willingness to accept that job, right? And so the more people that you hire, the less you have to pay them. You're not operating at some market rate for capital, right? So, for instance, if you were U.S. Steel and you were the only game in town in Pittsburgh in the 1900s, early 1900s, then you could hire as many people as you could, but the more people you wanted to hire, you'd have to attract local talent or whatever, people to come from other places to work for you, and you'd have to increase your wage, right? So the more people that you want to hire, the more you pay. I think I said less. The higher the wage, right? We're assuming away from that. We actually will analyze something very close to monopoly, where you're the only seller in town. But the idea is that for now, we're thinking of this as being a large competitive market, and the demand for a particular input vector from this firm is not going to change the costs across the economy, right? So the costs are going to be constant, independent of the firm's demands for them. This is exactly the same assumptions that we made when we were talking about consumption, so I'm not going to hammer them home too much. The same cautions apply, the same reason we're doing it applies, so there's nothing too much there. So what is the firm's goal here? So far, we've just talked about a firm as a technology that buys inputs, creates outputs, and now we're saying has to pay for those inputs. But what is the firm actually trying to do, right? What is its objective? A consumer's objective was to maximize its utility or minimize its expenditure to hit a certain utility target. Here we're going to take sort of that minimization approach. A firm has a contract to supply Q units of an output. Say the firm, is contracted with the government or with some of it's a supplier for other firms, or it's Netflix and it has a certain subscribers and it has to produce the content for those subscribers. Whatever it is, the firm has to create Q units, right? And it's going to get some fixed, money or whatever for that meeting that contract, supplying Q or more units of output, and we're asking how is the firm going to achieve its goal in the sense that how does the firm decide which inputs to get in order to create the Q units of output it's required to create. So in other words, we have an input target and we're trying to find the most efficient production method to achieve that input target, where efficiency is going to be assumed to be that of minimizing costs. So you're going to choose inputs in a way to produce Q at the least cost, at the smallest possible cost, and we're minimizing cost subject to producing at least Q units of output. In other words, the solution to the minimization problem would be to minimize the total cost, which is the cost of labor times the price of labor, plus the cost of capital times the price of capital, subject to the constraint that the production, F of KL, that's the technology of the firm that can turn these inputs into outputs at a rate of F given K and L inputs, subject to F of K and L, the production, being greater than this quota, this target that the firm has to meet, that it's contractually obligated to meet. Now, if this particular equation or this particular optimization problem doesn't strike you as looking extremely familiar, I would go back and watch the previous videos and really pay more attention in the future, because this is expenditure minimization, right? This is exactly the consumer's problem when they're trying to minimize expenditure subject to the utility being at some utility target, right? All we've done is PL became CL, PK became CK, F of K and L was U of K and L, right? And U bar was Q, or U little q was little u, or whatever. Nothing is, we're just one-to-one trading off the names of variables. But it doesn't matter what the names of the variables are, right? This is exactly the problem of expenditure minimization for a consumer. The interpretation is very different. The interpretation here is of a firm meeting a production quota, deciding what inputs to hire, right? How much capital and labor to hire, to employ, subject to meeting some contractual obligation. That's very different than a consumer saying, I want to spend the least amount of money to obtain some utility value, right? To be at least as well off as something. It's from an interpretation perspective, a very different problem. From a mathematical perspective, it is exactly the same problem. And now we can see really, crystal clear what the very big benefit of wrapping everything in this mathematical language is, right? It allows us to reuse the results we already have, because this is exactly the expenditure minimization problem. In other words, we already know that at the optimum, unless you're at a corner solution, the rate, the ratio of prices, here prices are costs, right? The price of capital is the cost I pay for capital. So the ratio of costs or prices is going to be equal to the ratio of the marginal production the marginal productivity of capital and labor, right? So on the right-hand side here, we have the marginal rate of technical substitution. On the left-hand side, we have the marginal rate of the ratio of costs. But this is exactly just what we already know, right? That the ratio of prices is equal to the marginal rate of substitution, just with our new notion of prices and our new notion of marginal rates of substitution. The intuition is the same. If this wasn't true and you were at an interior in your, you were employing some capital and some labor, you were at a positive vector of inputs where you were employing both, you could make an infinitesimal shift towards the cheaper input, where cheaper is relative to its productive value, right? So it's cheaper in the marketplace compared to how much it contributes. It's cheaper to trade them off in the marketplace than it is to make up for one with the loss of another, right? That's what this marginal rate of technical substitution is if I lose a little bit of labor, how much capital do I have to replace that lost labor with? And if it's easier to sell some labor or not hire it and then buy another tractor, and that more than makes up for the technological loss of that labor, then it's worth it. And you should make an infinitesimal switch, selling labor and buying tractors, right? And obviously, if the ratio was in the other direction, then you would want to sell a tractor and hire another farmhand. right? And of course, this is a marginal consideration. It doesn't say you want to sell all your tractors or all your laborers. It just says you want to make a small correction, but at the optimum, it must be that you don't want to make any correction, including a small one, which is where this first order condition becomes necessary. Here's a graphical interpretation. You might as well be seeing budget sets and indifference curves, but instead we're seeing ISO cost lines and ISO quants. ISO cost lines are budget sets, right? That's the lines of constant cost trading off capital and labor relative to the market cost. And the curved line is the ISO quant. That's a line of constant production. Any input vector on that line will produce the same output. Other than the interpretation, nothing new is here. So I'm going very quickly because this is just a word-for-word translation of the consumer's problem. We can define the conditional factor demand, in parentheses, Hicksian demand, right? The conditional factor demand is the input vectors that solve this problem. So it's K star and L star, the optimal level of capital and the optimal level of labor, which solve the problem of producing at minimum cost when the cost vector is given by C and the production target is given by Q. So let's do an example. We have a firm. The production function is K to the alpha, L to the beta. So this is a Cobb-Douglas production function with exponents alpha and beta. And the firm therefore wants to solve the problem given some cost vector CKCL and some production target Q of minimizing the total cost subject to the production being above the level Q, weakly above the level Q. The Lagrangian associated with this is given here by this nice equation L. We know we can use an equality constraint for the same reasons we could before. I'm going to leave that as a question for you. Make sure that you know the answer to that, right? That's the kind of question which is bound to show up on a midterm or a final. Why can we use equality constraints instead of inequality constraints when certain conditions are met? Hint, hint, monotonicity. So the associated Lagrangian is this guy, right? Because we're minimizing, not maximizing. We take some first order conditions. We get these beautiful babies down here, L1, L2, L lambda. We have the same plan of attack as we've always had. We're going to divide L1 by L2, and then the lambdas will cancel out. We'll have a ratio of costs on one side and a marginal rate of technical substitution on the other. And when we do that, we get CK over CL is equal to alpha over beta, L over K, right? The left-hand side is the ratio of costs. The right-hand side is the marginal rate of technical substitution. We solve that for L in terms of K, and we get that L is equal to CK over CL, beta over alpha K, and we can plug that back into the Lagrangian, and we get these nice conditional factor demands. I will do the algebra for you guys just because I think I don't want anyone to be too scared off of it. So we'll just make sure that everyone's on the same page. So hopefully everyone can follow, right? You divide the first order conditions, you get this ratio of costs and the technical rate of substitution, and you can solve for L in terms of K. Why is that not working? What's going on? Okay, there's just technological glitch. All right, so we have L is equal to CK over CL, beta over alpha K. That is we already had that from the slide, so I'm just rewriting something that was on the slide. And then we have our lambda first order condition, or our constraint that the F of KL is greater than or equal to Q, which is another way of saying that K raised to the alpha, L raised to the beta is greater than or equal to Q. Now we're going to plug this L in for that L, right? And we get that K raised to the alpha, CK over CL, to beta over alpha K raised to the beta is greater than or equal to q. And now it's just a matter of solving this thing for k. Right? So we can pull out a k to the beta in front, and we get a k alpha plus beta. And then we get ck over cl, beta to the alpha, k, raised to the, without the k. We pulled the k out front. Beta is greater than q. Right? This comes from the same, when you multiply two things with the same base and different exponents, you add the exponents and keep the base around. Right? Now what we want to do is divide both sides by this. Right? So we're going to divide both sides by that thing. And we're going to get k to the alpha plus beta is greater than q. And now it's going to have the same thing, but I'm going to raise the exponent to a negative. Right? So we have ck over cl, beta over alpha, but it's to the negative beta, right? Because I moved it from one side to the other. So I divided both sides by the thing with raised to the beta. That's the same as raising to the negative beta on this side. And now I just need to raise everything on both sides to the negative alpha over beta. Right? So this means that k is greater than or equal to q to the 1 over alpha plus beta, ck over cl, beta over alpha, negative beta to the alpha plus beta. And one hopes that that is, in fact, what I have written on the slide. And indeed it is. Now you can solve for L using symmetry, noticing you can replace alphas and betas wherever they show up, and CLs and CKs wherever they show up, and you should get the same answer as you had before. Or you can just go through it again and convince yourself that it works the other way. Either one of those things is fine, but the answer is going to be symmetric. So that's all for this video, and we're going to start talking about the cost function a little bit more in detail in a second.